the hope lies in the future. I'm really encouraged by the young energy I see among the design and construction professionals, not just here, but on all the project teams I'm on. So I'm optimistic.
All right, next installment of the podcast, we have another repeat guest. We have Matt Bronski from SGH, really known as, I would say, the king of historic preservation in New England. And although you might be humble as to not crown yourself as that, I would say you've really made your mark in the arena, would you say?
Well, I really appreciate the compliment. It's way too generous. I'll go for an aspiring lieutenant or jack rather than the king.
There we go. So I want the kind of theme of the discussion to be around the intersection or some conflict around performance and historic preservation, particularly because you are, as a profession, a practicing facade consultant. And so ultimately, I would view or assume your responsibility is to, for the most part, on a lot of projects, maximize performance and specifying or designing around those implications. But where do you either see professional or personal conflict in those two pursuits?
Yeah, so I'd say, as an envelope consultant, I think my role and the goals of the project really varies quite a bit when we have a new ground up building being built, and when we have a really major rehab, let's say it's a gut rehab of a building that's nondescript and not historic, and at the other extreme where we have a really significant historic building and we're keeping that in mind, we're trying to preserve as much historic fabric as possible. So I think, the goal on kind of the one end of that spectrum where we have the new ground up building, right? It's kind of all about performance today. And, obviously there are things like human comfort, there's, code, there's occupant safety and life safety and all those other things bring in. But let's generally call that performance, right? And on the historic end, if this is an absolutely, really nationally or even internationally significant building and has original historic fabric, performance gets really minimized and it becomes much more about kind of the holy grail of saving that rare historic resource. And, for most existing buildings, you're somewhere in between those two extremes, right? And it becomes often this question of how do we best balance these concerns, right? How do we improve performance and how do we retain as much architectural character, let's even call it, without kind of committing to the big H word of historic? How do we retain as much valuable original architectural character as we can while improving performance as much as we can? So you're somewhere in that middle ground.
Well, I think you just used a really good word, which is compromise. And I like to share details online just to hear feedback. And it's really the entire facade community chiming in, but you have people from a heating dominated climate, a hot hurricane zone, a seismic zone, all chiming in on the details. And really, these applications are climate and building specific. But one thing that I notice a lot when I put up replacement details is, oh, look at the interface detail. There's going to be condensation risk. You have major thermal bridging. And what people overlook is, A, when dealing with an existing building, you're not dealing with perfect conditions. You have to work
Right.
within constraints and parameters. So a lot of times it's putting your best foot forward. And B, that's just from a performance standpoint. The other end is budget. And owners don't have an unlimited spend. And so a lot of times it's doing your best to preserve the existing building stock. So I guess from your standpoint, is it really just your job to lay out options and help kind of elaborate on any potential risk to an owner and then let them decide accordingly?
Well, I think, it kind of depends partly on the attitude of the owner, but I think in a lot of cases, they view that as not our full job because often if we just lay out options and say, well, you're the owner, it's your building, you choose. And they say, well, you're the expert. That's why I hired you. What do you recommend? Right. So I think it's always good to lay out options, even options that you don't think are very worthwhile, because the owner may get the question of, well, why didn't you do this? Right? So if you laid out this option and you ticked off all the reasons that that isn't a good choice in this situation, then they can answer that question when it comes up from their colleagues or their boss, right? So if we lay out all the options and we lay out pros and cons and we make a recommendation and then we justify why we think that's the best choice in this particular case, then at least they have something to go on. And, they might not always agree with it. They might say, I'd love to do that, but I don't have the budget for that or whatever, right? Then at least they can kind of see your line of thinking and you can engage in this conversation. And hopefully it's something that happens all the way through so they aren't just blindsided with a recommendation they weren't expecting at the very end.
Where do you see the delineation between facade consultant or even commissioning agent and the architect or designer of record?
Yeah, that can often get a little bit tricky, and I guess there are a lot of permutations and different ways it could go. Sometimes we are, as an engineer or an envelope engineer, sometimes we are the designer of record for windows or fenestration. I would say more often we're a consultant to an architect who is the designer of record for the fenestration. And in a lot of cases, the envelope commissioning agent is an independent third party that comes in the end and might be hired by the owner to just give a fresh eye look and a really independent opinion. And there's some value of that, and we have had many cases where the owner and the architect say, we're really comfortable working with you and we value kind of consistency over that independent third party aspect. So we'd like to have you do this too. So it really depends what they're after. And there are just a lot of different ways that can be set up.
So as sort of given your engineering or technical background, let's start with your favorite and then your least favorite. Who do you most enjoy working with, for the most part, on project teams, whether it's collaboration or communication with the owner, subcontractors, or the design team? And on the flip side, who do you generally have the most irritation with? And that, it's challenging because you can have a good owner and you can have a bad owner, and really how you define that is going to be specific to you.
Yeah, well, I'd say the general condition that to me is absolutely the most frustrating is when we really recommend something strongly, maybe in kind of an initial condition assessment report or maybe in a design development report. And then maybe the same thing comes up again in design when we're redlining, peer reviewing window drawings, and we just keep saying the same thing again and again, and it just gets ignored and doesn't get carried forward. Obviously that's frustrating because we feel like, well, why did they even hire us? And no one's listening. And I think the most rewarding and most fulfilling is really not just when we're in a peer reviewing role and they listen. To me, it's when it's a really collaborative approach where the owner, the contractor, the architect, the engineer, the manufacturer, the supplier are all really working together and kind of brainstorming it together and developing details, materials, approaches that really make sense in that particular case. I think one example I can think of that was really incredibly rewarding and really incredibly collaborative in that way was the renewal of the Kresge Auditorium at MIT. And that was just incredibly collaborative between us and the architect who was EYP at the time, now Page. MIT, really a lot of their project management staff and facility staff were really technically inclined and really had good questions and really good input. The general contractor, the glazer, the manufacturer, all kind of came together on a renewal project. So that was, again, one of those ones that was really in the middle. It was very, very significant historic building, mid-century modern building, Aerosarin in 1955, really innovative steel and glass curtain wall at the time. And parts of it were still in good shape and parts of it had really had it and were pretty worn out. So it was a collaborative effort to kind of custom remake the parts that were really worn out, work out some kinks and some minor minor problems in the original design with galvanic action and corrosion and come up with a solution for really an extensive renewal. And I think it kind of showed their thoughtfulness on the project that MIT really thought long and hard and they came up with that word, not just for the curtain wall, but for the entire project. Because they say, well, this isn't a restoration. We're not kind of trying to save every screw here We're not out there with lab coats and syringes trying to hold it all together. We really do want to improve performance. We want to improve energy efficiency. We want to improve the resistance to wind load, the resistance to breakage when students are out there with frisbees and flinging lacrosse balls around and things like that. We want to improve the safety, but we really want to respect and renew the original design, which has been pretty muddied up by corrosion and breakage and deterioration over the years, and kind of restore it to its original grandeur, even if we're improving some of the performance and some of the materials. So that's exactly in the middle ground, and I think, one of the best possible ways. It's really not a compromise. It's almost more of a can we have it all kind of question from the owner. That worked out really well and was extremely collaborative. And we ended up publishing a paper about that. That was also really collaborative. So myself, one of my colleagues here at SGH, one of the architects, David Fixler, who was with EYP at that time and teaches now at Harvard, and one of the MIT facilities people, Gary Tondorf Dick, all wrote a paper together, presented it together at a Facades conference out in LA, and just a great project and a lot of fun to work on.
I think you have these anomaly projects that are fun to do case studies on and pass them around the office to share lessons learned. But I've spoken with some of the facilities people at MIT that we've jointly worked on projects with, and you really see them fulfilling their commissioning implement or strategy from day one to project closeout. And it's admirable that they stay true to their long-term campus goals. But the reality
I was going to say, and I think MIT's kind of, really long history of being technically innovative played into that project in terms of how can we really do this? How can we innovate here? How can we realize all those goals that seem a little bit disparate at first? And we did things like laser welding of stainless steel to refabricate some elements that were, kind of unusual processes at that time for curtain wall work to kind of make it all come together. And, I think they've been on the forefront of being innovative. And I think another one of those really rewarding collaborative projects for me was working with you and working with Harvard on the Blackstone steam power plant at Harvard, where they were saying, all right, all the historic windows on this historic building, except for one part of one window, are totally lost. We want to make this building more resilient. We want to design it for some really high wind loads so it can weather a really severe storm, severe wind event, hurricane, etc. But guess what? Here's an old archival photo. We want to make it look like this, right? Hey, can you guys put your heads together and do it? So I think that one became extremely rewarding and collaborative in the same way, where you had some really great ideas. Our structural team had some really great ideas. We kind of put it all together. How do we make this work from a waterproofing standpoint? How do we capture the shadow lines and kind of the depth and richness and of that original window system? And how do we do it in a different material that's going to meet these structural loads, right? We're not going to do this all in wood, and it's not going to be durable if we do. So, we're going to need to do this in aluminum. We're going to need some steel backup. And how can that fit behind here? How can that be attached structurally? All those things. So those are two in my mind that the challenge was greater in both those cases. It wasn't just just match what's there, right? It was much more than that. But the journey and the collaboration and the working together on it was just really rewarding.
Yes. Yes. And where I wanted to go with that thought is, especially as you continue to grow as a professional, but also mentor, others throughout SGH, when you're not dealing with these institutional clients, when you're dealing with condo boards, when you're dealing with private developers, and they hire you in an effort to renew or restore their building, how have you found yourself growing, maybe lessons learned from the past in terms of not having you just look like the bad guy redlining all the documents and really trying to have a true impact, but be conscious of their lens that they may be looking differently at the property than MIT or Harvard may?
Yeah, certainly a developer, it can be much more challenging because often their time frame is maybe at the longest the life of the lease, and maybe at the shortest until they flip this thing and get out themselves, right? So maybe you're looking at a couple of years to 15 to 30 years. And whereas a university client that's really has a historic building, often they want to keep it forever. You know, it's just a really important part of the fabric of the university and the culture, and the alumni are really emotionally tied to it. It's on the letterhead, kind of all that stuff, right? So they really do want to keep it forever. So there are two totally different mindsets that come with that. So I think trying to bring that long-term durability, let's make this work forever approach to a developer project can be really challenging, where all you're going to hear is too much money, too much money. How can we simplify this? How can we cut costs? Right.
I
So
think an exception might be, I'm not going to name the project or the client, but we're jointly pursuing a very large scale project that has a very historic looking existing, very large opening. And this is not an institutional client. And there are, you have to play homage to the community around and maintaining that existing infrastructure. But if it's a tough market and they're over budget, I think when you have either some type of tax credit implications, or the building is listed on a national register as a landmark in some form, you kind of have that sort of ammo to push
right.
that angle. But if you don't have that, what's something you see today that 5 years ago would have really surprised you? Do you think, I mean, especially just given the really tough market that we're in right now with construction spending and even supply chain issues during COVID, have you really had to morph or adapt in terms of um, setting your own personal expectations in terms of what is likely going to be achieved on these projects?
Yeah, I think maybe I've been fortunate enough that I haven't had to compromise that much on Windows as a result of supply chain issues. You know, I know on a lot of our other assemblies, component assemblies, especially during the height of COVID, it's just like, we can't get this insulation board, we can't get this cover board, roofing materials are just so far out, and substitutions are just coming in left and right that we're not accustomed to getting. But I think personally, I was a little bit lucky for whatever reason, where it didn't really afflict me as much in the window market the past couple of years.
Boston seems to be a little bit of an insulated market in that sense, in terms of the type of clientele. Obviously, the progressiveness in terms of the stretch code and the expectations that have sort of been set throughout the community to continue to set the bar higher. And there is a little bit of like a peer pressure element to it that I think everybody's trying to maintain a certain standard.
Right. Yeah, there certainly is. I think it goes way back. It must have been, gosh, close to 20, maybe more than 20 years ago that Massachusetts became one of the first states in the US to adopt a really stringent air barrier requirement. Really, other than Canada, I think it was kind of a leader in the US in that regard. And we all kind of had to adapt and figure out, how are we going to do this? What are the materials? What can we use? How can we detail it? And the stretch code is really progressive, and so people are kind of scrambling to catch up and get out in front of it and really do better. So, and maybe part of that is, we have such a strong kind of college and university presence here in Massachusetts, and especially in the Boston Cambridge area. So you do get that kind of forefront of academic thinking inflecting the design community, in a positive way, and even the codes as well. And the
Outside of just
designers rising to the challenge as well when those codes change.
outside of the windows for a second, because I think windows are a little easier to digest for someone who's not in the fenestration world. An
Mhm.
owner will walk up and see, oh, my beautiful new windows, or they'll feel a better performing operable window, whether it means less draftiness, less condensation, and so forth, or new glass, or a new pretty mutton pattern. But what about when you're looking at the opaque area, and you're talking to a developer about either uninsulated brick, or maybe cracks that are propagating, or areas in the brick that might lead to leaking, especially at the interface between the brick and the window? Do you find it more challenging to maybe upsell remediation, given it's something that people can't really see, even like thermal bridging through the opaque area, unless you're looking at some type of thermal imaging, a developer's not really going to care. They're going to say, my brick looks fine. Is it going to fall off? And you're going to say, maybe not. And they're like, all right, leave it.
Yeah, so I really don't do that much developer work, really just a tiny bit. So, I fortunately don't have to deal with that type of mentality too much. But it does seem to me like owners and, the good contractors that we work with, and there are many good contractors we work with, the contractors are almost proactive and thinking, boy, I don't want a callback here, right? I don't want this to leak. It's easier to get it tight now. What do we really need to do? Did you do the water testing you need to do? We want to know that before we kind of put the cladding over it, and it's easier to fix now. So I am seeing in a positive way contractors being really enlightened about that.
Before the contractors engage, though, I'm talking early, even like feasibility or assessment stage, when they ask you to come in and they say, look at my glazing, look at the brick, tell me if there's any options, and to convince them to do either a full repointing or something to the opaque elements. Do you run into trouble there where they kind of keep kicking the can down the road?
Yeah, I mean, for sure when you have maybe a condo board or something like that that's really short on money, and the repair that's really needed is costly and expensive, you definitely see kicking the can down the road. And we don't have money to do that now. Maybe we can put that on the horizon, start tucking some money away every year and do that in 10 years. But what can we do now? Can we just go up there and squirt a lot of sealing, right? And that's invariably the low cost solution that unfortunately gets suggested in every one of those situations.
Yeah, I mean, I just envision, I'm thinking a condo board. If you had to try to sell them on window replacement, if you did a mock-up, I think then you can have a prospective tenant or a renter or something come in and be like, okay, I would pay this much more to live in this apartment with these beautiful windows. When it comes to the roof and the brick, it's people don't really look at it, well, unless you have a leaky roof, but people don't really look at it as a um, performative enhancer. Really, it almost becomes the building owner's problem, and the tenants don't really see the benefit.
Yeah, that's true. On something like a roof, everyone is going to agree it can't leak, right? We just can't have leaks right into the unit. So that much is pretty consistently agreed upon. But if you're trying to upsell them on, why don't we put in a 30-year membrane as opposed to a 20-year membrane? That can be a hard sell if there's no added value perceived to the occupants, right? If you're going to put in an amenity roof, and they now have some skyline views and they have a place to go and relax with a drink, then they might see that as value added. But a 20-year membrane versus a 30-year membrane, I mean, that's a much harder sell.
Do you see more offices throughout the country engaging with you or your team in Boston around either how to manage the new air infiltration requirements or new thermal requirements and how to implement some of this? Because again, like you said, a lot of this is people are sort of adapting as things happen in real time. I mean, I posted this morning a video that FX Collaborative did on a bird friendly project in a residential application, and on an institutional building, especially even like the Harvard project we worked on, that wasn't bird friendly, but you had a dotted frit pattern for some type of shade for a shade as a shading element, and in institutional buildings, I think a dot pattern is acceptable. But in a multifamily building, nobody wants to look at building A that has transparent glass and building B that has dots all over the glass, and the developer's not going to want to hear it. So in New York with the bird friendly, we're really kind of having to remain on the fly. And I think it's
Right,
really
right.
challenging for the design community. So do you feel an element of that with all the recent changes in Boston?
Oh, yeah. I think there's certainly an element of having to quickly learn and adapt on the fly, as the new code changes first come out, and then we're all scouring them and reading them. And seeing some language that's a little bit ambiguous and wonder, well, you could interpret it like this, or you could interpret it like that, and how are the code officials going to see that? And then starting to feel our way through that and have some conversations with code officials. It's a process, and it's a
Did
process that
SGH in
takes
Boston
time.
have some type of involvement either on committees or some type of steering committee to help the code officials write the stretch code?
Not that I know of. No.
Because I know SGH had involvement in writing Local Law 97 here in New York. And so, yeah, like you said, I would imagine, especially for some of the younger consultants, it's like every project is up to interpretation. I mean, I see it all the time with meeting U values. Are we doing NFRC guidelines?
Right.
How is this fenestration qualified? Are we looking at all sizes? You know, a window replacement job at Harvard with 300 different window types. Are you modeling every single window type? And then I guess the question you have to ask is, especially as a delegated designer or the facade consultant on record, there's an inherent risk. There's an inherent risk you make a design decision, and then a few years down the line or after closeout, some code official interprets it differently. So I would imagine this is, you say it's challenging for you. Some of the younger professionals that work throughout your office, I feel like it could be a little overwhelming.
Yeah, for sure. I'd agree.
So I guess what's on the horizon that you see for the next couple years? Is there any themes that you're currently kind of seeing in the market? I think we see these cycles of new construction, back focusing on existing buildings, back to new construction, but I think Boston is a forever focus on the
Yeah.
existing infrastructure.
And I think with that focus on the existing infrastructure and with a lot of existing buildings, I'm starting to see a lot of progressive owners, the universities and designers who work for them, really looking much more closely at embodied carbon and not just operational carbon, right? So a lot of times when we say performance, we're talking solely about once you get it in and it's all done, right? um, what's the operational carbon, how much energy are we using, et cetera. And thinking more about embodied carbon of the window, the old window you might take out and throw away and replace, and trucking that off to a landfill, and the gas in the truck to drive it there and all that, and the embodied carbon and manufacturing a new window and shipping it here. And how does the operational savings, does it really start to pay for that or not? And what if we compared that to improving the existing historic windows, maybe not to quite as high a performance standard, but how does that play out in terms of the total cost to the environment of embodied and operational carbon? So I think owners here are starting to get smarter about that and really look at that as kind of the whole picture of, if the goal is really to help save the planet, let's look at it maybe a bit more holistically. New building coming out of the ground, you could really focus much more heavily on operational carbon, but where it becomes a question of replace or retain and enhance and renew, let's pick up that word again, then maybe that's kind of a balance to be considered.
Yeah, it's a sticky word, especially since I spent the majority of my career in the aluminum fenestration industry, and we're one of the maybe one of the bigger contributors. But there's other areas I think that we can focus on, especially means of insulated glass, and that's a really tricky topic. I posted recently about this idea of the forever IGU, and the problem with insulated glass is once you have one of the pieces of glass is coated, it's not necessarily recyclable, and then if you have a breach of that perimeter hermetic seal, you have to replace the unit, whether that's 5 years in or 20 years in.
Right.
But it's even as I think about it, the idea of accepting that, okay, maybe every 25 to 40 years we're going to have to replace the IGU, but how do we maximize the frame? How do we maximize that interface condition so that maybe we accept the fact that all we have to do is glass replacement, but everything can easily be restored or maintained?
Yeah, I agree. It's really an interesting notion. And at a facades conference maybe 10 years ago, I heard someone say that, we're taking one of the most inherently reusable, recyclable materials on Earth, glass, and we're making it really hard to use or recycle it when we make it into IGU. So we've got to come up with a better way of making IGU. So thank you for kind of bringing that issue forward and getting all the thoughtful people on your podcast to start to think about it.
Do you
Um,
think, in terms of the embodied carbon topic, it's one of these again that you talk to 10 people about it and you're going to hear 10 different thoughts and 10 different approaches. And it's it's really challenging to grasp whether you think about life cycle or, as you said, transport to the job site, or even how many man days you're on the construction site and the required operational energy just to run that construction job site versus maybe prefabricating, transporting versus overseas versus domestically. There's almost like so many variables that come into play that it's almost like focusing and specializing in embodied carbon seems like it could be, a focus field that somebody dedicates their career to, or really focuses on moving forward.
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of kind of sustainability consultants are really starting to dive pretty deep into this. And you even see some of the guidelines are starting to define local materials as, say, 500 kilometers, roughly 250 miles or whatever, and really trying to think about how far away are our materials coming from, what is the embodied carbon, what's the operational carbon, what's the performance, and it's really pretty complex to decide how do you weigh all those variables, right? And but that's kind of, I think, where the sustainability world is going, is that much more comprehensive view of the world outside of just pure performance once something is installed, without any look at durability, lifetime, life expectancy, or what happens at the end of that road, right?
Well, I think I might be mis speaking here, but I don't believe the passive house principle embodies embodied carbon, or accounts for, rather, embodied carbon. And so you sit here and you think, how do we make our what's the first question we always get asked? What's the U value of your window? And, well, is it this? Is it this? It's a very multifaceted question. But you get a window that performs 10% better from a U value standpoint because of hyper-insulated framing, but all of a sudden your embodied carbon on that goes up 20%. So was it a worthwhile pursuit or exercise? And it depends on how you're looking at it. But I don't know, the idea of really balancing the two might be a complete paradigm shift in terms of what we consider business as usual today.
Right. And I'm even seeing, the universities and sustainability consultants are really trying to say, not what's the latest and greatest sustainability standard, and then we're going to do the best we can on that scorecard. It's going to be, we're going to look at these 4 or 5, right? But we're really going to kind of make this building as sustainable as we possibly can. We think this standard's a little better at this, and this is a little better at this, and none of them fully captured this, but we're going to set that as a goal. So it's almost kind of the confidence of the universities to say, we're gonna kind of set our own standard, right? We're not just gonna check boxes or try to get the highest score we can on any one of these ourselves. We're gonna try to push the boundaries and do the best we can in a much more comprehensive way.
Yeah, I say often that, I look back at the lead initiatives, and though at times it might have been incomplete, at least it was trending us in a certain direction where,
Right.
if anything, maybe the most effective result of it was that it got sustainability on the forefront of everyone's minds. So
Exactly.
although you might have a LEED Gold or LEED Platinum building, even if it's not a great performer today, that kind of stuck with people that, okay, sustainability, energy performance matters. So now that we have these stretch energy codes and passive house principles that are really making the teams and the buildings accountable for not just what's designed, but implementation, because
Right.
now we have a means of measuring performance,
Mhm.
whether it's air tightness testing or utility bills. It's an outcome-based mentality,
Right.
which I think is, if anything, that's where we need to continue to head moving forward.
Yeah, I agree completely. Yeah, the outcome is what really matters. Right?
I really enjoyed catching up. I'm happy you came on. And anything else you want to share with the audience or your younger team?
The hope lies in the future. I'm really encouraged by the young energy I see among the design and construction professionals, not just here, but on all the project teams I'm on. So I'm optimistic.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. Happy
All
connecting.
right. Thanks, Adrian. Take care.
Talk soon.